Welcome to another episode of Medicare Industry Insider. I'm Jalen Jackson.
And I'm Rachel Bremeyer.
And this is part 3 of our 3-part series on what is Medicare going to look like, what may happen over the next 4 years in the second Trump administration. So we've already talked a little bit about the judicial branch and the executive branch and what we may see from some of those federal agencies, from the courts. Today, we're going to talk legislation. We're going to talk about what the GOP supermajority in the House, Senate, and White House might mean over the next couple years. And then, of course, depending on the midterms, maybe the next full 4 years. So we'll get into some healthy speculation, talk about a couple bills that are already introduced in the 119th Congress, and talk a little bit about what the makeup of the two houses have in store for us.
Yeah, so it is going to be interesting for the next 2 years. We have a majority House and Senate. So as of right now, and we will see after that because they'll have more elections after 2 years. But the Senate currently is sitting at 53 Republicans and 47 Democrats. So there's a majority Senate. And then in the House, we have 220 Republicans and 215 Democrats. So the Republicans gained 4 seats for the majority of the Senate this year. So it is going to be a very interesting year with the trifecta of both Senate, House, and President all being majority Republican.
But I will add, those are extremely narrow margins. There was already a lot of early talk about filling some of those vacant seats. I know I saw there was at least one senator or representative that decided not to run for a state office in their home state because they were worried that the margins were too narrow. So doing a little taking one for the team. But really, I think the big thing, especially in the Senate, is looking at the makeup of those senators, those 53 GOP senators. Not all of them are the biggest fans of Trump. So that narrow majority could get slimmer still when there are ideological differences on the line.
100%. We were even joking and talking through, like, if you had looked at this particular person back in, the 70s, they would have been a Republican, but they're a Democrat. So we're in vice versa. So we were kind of looking at specific people and laughing at just how they ran and the different things that they ran off of. And
yep.
It's interesting.
And at the time we're recording this, we're already seeing some of that tension, unrelated to healthcare to an extent, but during the Senate confirmation hearing of Pete Hegseth, we already saw Vice President J.D. Vance had to cast that tiebreaker vote because 3 Republican senators broke with the Democrats to tie that up. So very well could be a hotly contested year in the Senate. In the House, that 5-vote margin means even less in some cases. It is a very, very tight year for legislation for sure.
So the next thing we're going to go into is committees. But before we go into committees, we thought it would be good to define what is a committee. So committees basically are where things go before a vote in the Senate and House are completed. So, for example, if you wanted to have anyone look over markups, change language, modification, look at financial side of things before it goes to a vote, that's what committees are for. So we'll dive into all the different types of committees. And one of the ones that I think you should specifically talk on, because you've sat on the Ways and Means Committee.
Well, I've been in a meeting with them. I had never been an elected official.
You have been in a meeting as a specialist in that field in the Ways and Means Committee. But I think that'd be a good one for you to kick off our committees with.
Well, sure. And so as we talk about committees, remember, this is why, and I'm sure if you've watched any of our episodes, you've heard us probably complain a little bit about Ron Wyden and the Senate Finance Committee, complain about some of these other committees. And that's really because there are these very specific senators and congresspeople that have an undue influence on what legislation is able to be passed, because before something can ever go to the full floor for a vote and pass the House of Congress, you do have to get through that committee process, and the chairman of the committee controls that calendar. So if a bill gets brought up that they simply don't like, they can just kind of sit on it and it never goes anywhere. So as we look at the Ways and Means Committee, that is really the the people that hold the purse strings. They deal with funding and finance, taxes, tariffs, legislation that has to do with certain social services programs. It has been a core committee for a lot of people who want to expand their political influence. Getting on the Ways and Means Committee that's the A team. That's where people want to be. And in fact, right now, Jason Smith, one of our representatives here in our home state of Missouri, is the chairman of Ways and Means. So love to see that, and we'll be meeting with him in D.C. shortly at Capitol Conference. By the time you're listening to this, we will have already met with him, but at the time we're recording, still preparing for that Capitol Conference trip at the end of February. So Ways and Means has a lot of tax policy implications. They oversee Medicare Part A since it's funded by that payroll tax, and they have shared jurisdiction with some of the other committees, such as the House Energy and Commerce Committee.
Mm-hmm. Another committee that we wanted to at least highlight as something that to pay attention who's on that, who you can meet with. Just like Jalen said, this is the side of government that you have a lot more influence on by meeting with a lot of the local reps, having more conversations, visiting with Ways and Means Committee like Jalen did. The Senate Finance Committee is going to be the committee that handles taxation and other revenue measures and oversees both Medicare and the ACA side. So again, they also hold some purse strings and make sure that our fields are running smoothly and have the money and funding they need.
Absolutely. So we've also got the HELP Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. Famously, one of the core members of that committee famously has been Bernie Sanders, also Bill Cassidy from Louisiana. So this is a committee that deals with a lot of federal labor and employment laws, regulates wages, hours of employment, works closely with the Department of Labor, mining and workplace health and safety, things like that. So a lot of tangential relationship to Medicare itself. They don't have direct oversight of a lot of Medicare aspects, but they do handle a lot of things regarding health and safety, and of course labor. So how we pay our employees, how we deal with contractors, what the laws surrounding things like that is.
So as a business owner, that's like something that you'd want to watch just to make sure that you're lining up with any sort of pay changes or things that the government is then trickling down as a business owner. The next thing we want to go into is how Congress impacts Medicare. This is going to be kind of where the meat and potatoes are. Medicare, obviously Congress steers committees, steers regulation. They can call hearings, bring in expert testimonials, create regulation. So you may see a lot of different types of hearings. And actually, this is kind of one of the fun things that, again, it's going to be on record forever. But if there is a hearing called, you can see CMS and HHS create new regulations as they go through and actually be watching things online as it goes through.
So there's a lot of things that Congress maybe knows they can't do on their own. They aren't maybe going to be able to pass a bill because of the party line splits. They know they don't have the votes to pass a piece of legislation, but maybe there's something that can be done on the regulatory side by a government agency. So a lot of times these major committees, Senate Finance, of course, in the news all the time in our Medicare world, they will call hearings, bring in expert testimony to support kind of their vision for the Medicare program. We see this pretty consistently. We'll have a Senate Finance hearing. There will be some testimony provided. A week or so later, CMS or HHS will come out with a piece of new regulation, new rulemaking that will then go into effect in the future. So it's a pretty common way to help provide public context for regulations that they want to see, working a lot, almost in tandem with these federal agencies. So providing that public context so people better understand an issue before that piece of regulation comes out, and also providing a little bit of cover almost, just in a way of they've got people in front of them, they're answering questions, those folks get to read testimony. And again, like Rachel said, anyone can submit testimony to written testimony to those committee hearings. And again, reminder that it will be public record forever. Anyone can look it up. You are going to be signing your name to it. So Be cautious if you choose to go that route, but it is an option. So it's a great chance to get public input on laws and regulations. It's also a great chance to kind of preview some of those regulations before it comes out of a federal agency.
There's a lot of things like as you're watching it online that you can look up and see exactly where it is at. Specifically to legislation on this division that we're talking about creates a lot of acts and laws that are passed. We have seen a lot of them in the insurance world. Specifically, there's a lot of different things, but specifically we've seen some that are regarding PBM, IRA, telemedicine. There's a lot of things that we are seeing trickle down and we'll probably continue to see in the Trump era. I'm kind of jumping ahead with some speculation.
No, you're absolutely right, though. I mean, we've already seen, going back to the previous administration, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the incredible impact that has already had on the industry, the price negotiations that have already started with CMS and will start taking effect in 2026. And granted, if we look at this, a lot of GOP senators and congressmen haven't necessarily had a lot of reason to publicly declare whether they continue to support or are against certain provisions of the IRA. But what we do know, like you said, jumping ahead a little bit, but I think this kind of all flows together. What we do know is that in Trump's first term in office, he was a huge proponent of negotiating drug prices. We heard a lot about things like most favored nation pricing. We heard a lot about negotiating directly with drug carriers. It was under the Trump administration that CMS started the Part D senior savings model, the first attempt at lowering those insulin costs to
It was the first time in a very long time that drug prices had actually gone down instead of up. So yeah. I do think that we will see a lot more of that. I know we're speculating, we're jumping into that, but we probably will see a lot more streamlining prices, dropping prices for seniors at any cost. So we'll probably see that with drugs. We may see that with looking more into regulatory, or not really regulatory, but more fraud, waste, and abuse type things to make sure that claims are being processed correctly and money isn't getting spent incorrectly. As a business owner, Trump is very into efficiencies and making sure things are looking good. So we'll probably see a lot of that coming up.
I would also anticipate a lot of PBM legislation. We already saw that at the end of last year, at the end of 2024. There was some pretty wide-ranging and hugely impactful PBM legislation rolled into that omnibus bill to help fund the government that got pulled out at the last minute to make the deal. But I don't think that means that we're not going to continue to see more PBM legislation brought up, maybe regulation from some of the other agencies, just because, again, drug prices are a hot button issue for just about everyone. And I think while Republicans and Democrats may have some pretty major disagreements on how to best approach that, there's going to be a lot of common ground on this. It's been a long time since we've seen such an easy win bipartisan issue. It's something that I expect to see a lot of action on this year. And we've got some things we have to address. We've got telehealth expansion. That's coming up at the end of that was part of the omnibus, so I believe that goes through March. But at the end of March, we've got an expiration of that telemedicine extension.
Because it was supposed to expire at December. Yeah. And then they expanded it. That originally came from a COVID need where basically people needed other ways to see their doctors. And it's been expanded, and then we're looking at are we going to continue that since COVID's ended? Are we going to drop it? We've seen a lot of advantages, but it's also hurt some people in rural areas too. So they're doing a lot more studies on that. So we'll see on that. The other big thing that we'll probably see, I think we're kind of going to speculation, might as well. Other thing that we will see is ACA subsidies, potentially lowering tax credits or changing the income level for tax credits. So basically making it a little bit more difficult to get that full free, I'm air quoting if you can't see, free ACA, making sure that level, that criteria of the advanced tax credit that they're getting with the subsidies may change a little bit in the Trump era.
Yeah, absolutely. ACA, I think, is going to be a hot button issue for that first 100 days, just because that funding. There's some pretty big tax reduction priorities on Trump's docket that was promised in that first 100 days, and that money has to come from somewhere. So I think ACA subsidies traditionally have been a target for the GOP. So I don't think that's going to change all of a sudden. Although there is a lot of evidence showing that some of the largest growth in marketplace plans was in just thoroughly red GOP heavy states. So you've got all of these senators and congressmen that have to look towards reelection going, if my people in my state, my constituents, are as a vast majority choosing these on exchange plans through the marketplace, is that really something I want to mess with? So it could be something that maybe isn't impacted as much as we anticipated maybe 6 months ago, just because of some of those enrollment trends. But it is something that the deficit hawks, the folks that still are upset about the ACA expansion, or the ACA originally.
Yeah.
We've been told that repeal and replace is totally off the table a number of times, and I do think that's true. But the idea that subsidies aren't going to be adjusted or even removed from certain income classes is still very much on the table.
Yeah, another thing that we're probably going to see a lot more of is changes to the Medicaid funding. So work requirements was thrown out there, making it a little bit more difficult to qualify for, maybe changing the level. But again, it all goes back to we've started seeing this a little bit with some of the election period changes, but everything is the federal government getting their fingers a little bit more involved in the state government's rules and regulations regarding Medicaid, the Medicaid expansion. So we may see some of those changes coming up in this next term.
Yeah, I mean, there have been so many changes proposed, whether you look at some of these policy shops like Paragon, Cato Institute, Project 2025, kind of the big, typically right-leaning policy shops that we hear about on the news. There's a lot of changes to Medicaid that have been proposed, whether it's work requirements, whether it is putting individual caps so that, the Medicaid program will only spend up to a certain amount on each individual enrollee, or just changing the way that some of those billing credits with hospitals work. There's a lot of proposals to adjust how Medicaid works between that state and federal interface. So a huge chunk of that funding does come from the federal government. States do pick up a portion of the tab, and states generally administrate the Medicaid in that state, but a lot of it's still federally funded. So as the federal government goes, so do many of the states, because in many states it could be as much as half of or more of their budget could be picking up the tab on Medicaid. So it's a huge expense. It's a huge impact to a state, any of these changes that do get made. And of course, we can't ignore the fact that there is a push that we've already seen to change the way that Medicare and Medicaid interact in the form of integrated dual plans. So there was a push last year with the Duals Act of 2024 in the 118th Congress to force states into an integrated care model where they would have to have those partnership plans where they are, integrated Medicaid MCOs, managed care organizations, all with an accompanying DSNP product.
Right. And that's all happening this year. We're seeing that actually take effect with states getting a lot more and being not forced, or states being pushed to try and get integrated plans to allow that more of their Medicaid eligibles to have access to coverage with those. But again, that goes back to state and federal working a little bit more closely together, so the federal government has a little bit more line of sight.
Well, and you have to look at, and anyone who thinks that bureaucrats don't know what they're doing really doesn't see the whole picture, I think. I don't always, I tend to agree. But, if you look at some of the pieces of the puzzle, something that is a budget-friendly action, like putting individual spending caps on Medicaid, where the government's not going to spend more than a certain amount on each individual Medicaid recipient. Those capitated payments are a clear line in the sand to drive states to those integrated care models. Because if you've got capitated payments, what's the easiest thing to do? Reinsure that risk through a Medicare Advantage plan with a max out of pocket. That caps that state's price or cost risk.
So that goes nicely into our next topic of Medicare funding changes. We're probably going to see a lot of that. And especially what you just brought up, like the Medicaid working a little bit more closely with Medicare Advantage. Under the Trump administration, especially, we talked on a previous episode with Dr. Oz, being over that division, being very pro-Medicare Advantage. We will probably see a lot more pro-Medicare Advantage in the government going forward the next 4 years. However, there is a contingency because the other big push is streamlining a lot of the fraud, waste, and abuse that they've also seen, which typically comes from the Medicare Advantage side. So it's going to be this big give and take pull of like, which direction are we going? Is it pro-Medicare Advantage or are we cleaning up? Is it chicken or egg? Which one's coming first?
Yep, absolutely. Well, and I think, hopefully we can see the same amount of skepticism and, kind of the light shining on original Medicare as well. Because if you look at the numbers, traditionally, original Medicare has actually had a much higher rate of what they call improper payments as compared to Medicare Advantage. So some of the most recent Medicare reports actually show nearly double the dollar amount of improper payments run through original Medicare billing as compared to Medicare Advantage. So looking at funding is certainly something that's going to be on the mind of a lot of folks in Congress this year, just because of that kind of budget hospitality, these tax cuts that we're looking at, but also just skepticism of, are we getting our money's worth for Medicare Advantage? I think that's the big question kind of floating around the halls of Congress right now is, this was supposed to save us money compared to original Medicare. This was supposed to save us money in the long run by creating better health outcomes. We're basically 20 years in on Medicare Advantage in a serious way. So is it working? What changes do we need to implement to make sure that it continues to work in the future while continuing to reach that goal of 100% of beneficiaries being in value-based care by 2030? It doesn't appear, at least yet, that goal is going to change from CMS. So how that changes, definitely a lot of concern for the MA side, because we don't know how some of those changes may be implemented yet, which ones will be done from a regulatory standpoint, and where Congress may stick their head in the door and say, we've got an idea.
It is interesting, too. I think on top of all of the things happening with the Trump era, we're also in the silver tsunami. So our peak baby boomers turning 65 up until 2027. So through Trump's administration, we're looking at peak baby boomers. So I think across the board, this is just going to be a huge hot topic, is how are we handling Medicare, Medicaid, Medicare Advantage plans, fraud, waste, and abuse? Where's the money going? How are we spending this? We're going to have a large chunk of the population aging into this program to Medicare, and just making sure that it's efficient and that, people are taken care of in a way that is favorable for this next era. So we were hoping we'd have some NABIT talking points by now, but by the time this is recorded, we do not at this moment. But if you ever do want to know show notes or hear about that when this actually does come out, we should have NABIT talking points by then. You probably will have already come back from
when this comes out, I will be back.
So if you are curious and you're hearing this and you want to learn more, you're welcome to reach out. But essentially what we wanted to do on this, to kind of close it up with a nice bow, we've talked through all three branches of the government. This one in particular has a lot more call to action and things that you as an agent can do. Senators are very easy. They're pretty easy to get a hold of. You can reach out and you can schedule meetings with them. They're people that have very big influence in terms of what we just talked about with committees, with legislation, with moving things forward a little bit slower than some of the other branches, like the executive branch or judicial that we were just talking about. But it's a way to get your voice heard. Talking to people who have influence in this division is very helpful. I think we're starting to see a little bit of trickle down with some of the things that that we have had our hands in too, even in just a local level too. So it is important to reach out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would agree. Just, schedule those meetings, comments on rules and regulations, look at the right time of year. If you're going to an event like a Capitol conference or something like that, obviously that's a fantastic time to meet with your representatives and senators. But also look at some of the easier times of year to get a hold of them. Look at August recess when many of those folks are back in the district, in their home state. You don't necessarily have to travel to D.C. to meet with your representative. They're going to have an in-district coordinator that you should be able to meet with any time of the year. They're going to be back in district during that August recess typically. There are other ways to get the word out to your senator or representative, what your thoughts are on a particular piece of legislation or just general thoughts and concerns and ideas.
I've even seen virtual meetings too being a bigger thing recently since COVID. So like that's an option too if you can't catch them in that August time.
Of course. Yeah. So wrapping this one up, this is the end of the 3-part series. We don't do a lot of 3-part series on this show, but we thought this was a really interesting time to be able to hop in with a new administration, a new Congress, and look at what can we really expect for Medicare, for our industry during this second Trump administration. So hopefully you've enjoyed this series. You've enjoyed our insights, our speculation, even some of our disagreements, and we'll see you on the next episode.